the 37 practices of bodhisattvas, following what has been said by the excellent ones on the meaning of the sutras, tantras, and treatises. Though not poetically pleasing to scholars, owing to my poor intelligence and lack of learning, I've relied on the sutras and the words of the excellent, so I think these bodhisattva practices are without error. However, as the great deeds of bodhisattvas are hard to fathom for one of my poor intelligence, I beg the excellent to forgive all faults, such as contradictions and non sequiturs. Through the virtue from this may all living beings, the ultimate and conventional altruistic intention, and thereby become like the protector Chenrezig, who dwells in neither extreme, not in the world nor in peace. I'm bored. There they go. So good morning, everyone, and welcome, of course. A couple of announcements. One, Gretchen happened to go on the Garchin Institute's live streaming yesterday. They were getting set to do something, and she could see, of our 4 Sangha members who were there, she saw 3 of them sitting like 2 rows back, right in front of Rinpoche, so that's kind of fun. So Ryan and Michelle and Ben are there, and Anna is there too, but she's also there working. So we didn't, Gretchen wasn't looking for her, she forgot about that. She's probably out there making it all happen. And if any of you didn't see it, Anna sent just a beautiful photograph. Brings tears to your eyes, knowing the path to get there, of her standing with this wonderful, I think it was a sunset or sunrise in the background. That place is just marked by vast view. And of course, that's what's really so remarkable. We've got 2 ways we can be going up, 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 up in our practice towards the perfection of wisdom, which is what the Dalai Lama teaches publicly and Khenpo teaches all the time. But you can also do it if you have that kind of faith that the Buddhist view is correct and ultimate, you might say, because ultimate beyond ultimate. You can also practice with the view and looking down. So you can have primordial wisdom practicing from that point of view and looking down, and that's what the Tantra is. So the greatness here, as I saw us doing the refuge this morning, is that this refuge, the whole Buddhist world believes in Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, and all the profound meanings of that, outer, inner, secret meanings. But there's like this horizontal axis, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. But the Tantra takes it a step sort of further inner, and it has a vertical axis of the Lama, the meditational deities, the Yidams, and then the Dakinis and the Dakas. And so this is the subtle understanding of Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. And the greatness of what we've been trying to do here is you present the full range, because no one's being put into a box. You've got to do it this way, but rather you just offer the entire range, and therefore people find as they need. So anyway, very wonderful morning here. And of course, we're especially excited to have Tracy Stilerman, one of Gretchen and mine offsprings. I majored in biology. The sterility of my view and expression slips through all the time. At any rate, she teaches at Stanford and is going to speak to us this morning, as we've been advertising from the treetops. And I do have to laugh because I can't help but be the proud papa. I'm going to embarrass her. But really, all of us have somehow resulted in each one of us, really. It's the interdependence of practice and practitioners. It just raises it to a higher level. But little Tracy was the one who used to bring our 2 kids to Dharma events. And Tracy was the younger one, who was clinging to her mom a little bit and saying, "When are we going? I'm bored." But reality breaks through, and here she is. A big cheer from the back, right? All right. So is that enough of an introduction? Should I sit down and shut up?
Keep talking. I haven't figured out where this plug goes.
Oh, right. Your dad wearing a skirt. I was ahead of the curve. Dave is still plugging in the microphone for Zoomers. You want to just move this one over there, Dave?
No, it's not the micro. I can't
Oh.
plug the TV in because I can't figure out
Tracy, you taught me
Oh.
first, then
where this goes.
All right. Well,
you taught me field pot.
Rachel's back. Right. Yeah. So Zoomers, we're working to put it on visually. I think you can hear, but we're trying to do it visually too, so you can see. Oh, PowerPoint. Excuse me. Yeah.
I don't remember. That's the,
So all of us, again, the whole extended family is visiting for the holiday season, and all of us were sitting around the table last night, and especially the 7-year-old and the 6-year-old, get very excited together. And we were trying to calm everyone down. I said, why don't you go around the table and think, what's the best thing that happened to you today? So everyone started saying their things around, and thought we were done. The meal's continuing. Suddenly, little 3-year-old Emma comes up to her mother and says, I want to say what was the best thing for me today, too. And then she said, okay, Emma, so what? So what was the best thing that happened to you today? Coming to Grandma's house. Would you like the keys to the car, my bank account? What would you like? I know. Yeah. Exactly right. And she's still, because she's just recently really talking in a way that you can have a conversation, you still think she's little, and so she gets ignored. Right. It wasn't as outrageous as it sounds. Duct tape. Oh, good. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Rachel. Oh.
Staring into infinity, right? That's why I like this infinite regress.
Right. Oh. Yeah, we're going in the right direction. Here we go.
Can people on Zoom see this?
Yeah.
Yep,
It looks great.
looks good.
Can we see all the other slides?
Yeah.
I don't know.
You can move that top bar down to the bottom.
I'll start from first slide. Start from first slide.
Yep.
No, up one.
There we go. And then you can minimize with the single line on the left-hand side. Drag the bar down.
Right, there it is.
Yep, that's the one. Yeah, don't worry about that.
Wonderful, thank you.
Okay. Are we good?
Use the arrow.
Looking good.
Okay,
Yeah.
maybe.
Okay, you can go forward one, actually, that's the title that we're gonna get, yeah, so here's, so I wanna talk today, excuse me, too, my voice is a little off. Hi, everybody, it's nice to be back. It's been a while. I'm gonna talk today. I think that at the Dharma Center, we have a lot of context and discussion about sort of the tenets of Buddhism and the practice and the meaning behind it. And one thing that I have gone on to study also is the history, where Buddhists have been in the world and when and what they have done at different points. Closer? Okay.
As much as you can.
Okay. Better?
Yeah.
Good? Okay. And one of the things that I really dug into in my own studies is this relationship between Tibetan Buddhists and other parts of the world. And specifically, I have looked a lot at their relations with the emperors and the empires of China to their east. Have to think about directions sometimes still. And I find it really fascinating when you have these two very strong cultures next to each other. You know, what happens? How do they interact? And so this talk is gonna look a little bit at that. And we start with this image, which might look just like any other sort of tanka of a Tibetan Buddhist figure, but in fact, this is an image of the Qianlong Emperor, who was emperor of China of the Qing dynasty in the 18th century. And we're gonna take this as our starting point, and we'll get back here too. But the sort of question of my talk is, why would a Chinese emperor have themselves painted as a tanka? Right? And we're gonna look at this image a lot today. But I find it kind of fascinating because it was produced by the emperor's workshops himself at his direction, right? It's not the Tibetan Buddhists sort of liking him and then deifying him, right? This is his own project. So why would a Chinese emperor do that, right? So this is kind of the question we're gonna start with. Qianlong was a very interesting emperor. He was extremely cosmopolitan. And the Qing Empire, which is what he ruled over at this time, was a very multi-ethnic empire. It was ruled by the Manchurians, who were these people of the northern Asian plains to the north of what we think of as China. And they ruled over Mongolians and Han Chinese and Muslims and in some ways in Tibetans as well. And because of that, he had all sorts of ideas of how he could speak to each part of his empire and how he could also control each part of his empire. And so we're gonna see. But I also think that as interesting as he was, and as much as he was doing creative things in new ways to speak to these different peoples that he was ruling over, he also was part of an established tradition. And so we're going to take this image and see sort of the roots of it. Like in one sense, it looks like a very new thing in Chinese history. We don't have emperors in the past doing this exactly, but there are roots in previous periods. And so we're going to look a little bit at that. Okay, so you can go forward. Yeah, here we are. So the sort of relationship between Tibetan Buddhist lamas and emperors is sometimes something we call like a patron-priest relationship. You may have heard it spoken of that way. And it is this idea that the emperor was the ruler of the state and of the sort of worldly realm, and the Tibetan Lama was the ruler of the spiritual realm, and they supported the state by teaching Buddhism and taking care of spiritual concerns, while the emperor took care of sort of civil and secular side of it, if we can call it that. And the origins for this really start in this period in the 11th century. The main Chinese empire at the time was the Song dynasty. But at the same time, you can see the green part of the map here is what we call the Tangut dynasty. And this was a Central Asian semi-Tibetan people. Yes, thank you. Who lived in sort of the northwest part. You can see it's sort of to the northeast of Tibet. And they are the first to have established this post called an imperial preceptor. So they were a sort of multi-ethnic little empire, fairly strong, but a little bit separated from the Song. And they had this Buddhist kingdom on the Silk Road here. And these people, you can see there's a Thangka, there's a lot of different Buddhist art from this time period and from this kingdom, but this is just one I pulled up, is an image of green Tara. And they had a lot of different interactions happening through the Silk Road and through their sort of physical location. But they also took a great interest in Tibetan Buddhism. And so they invited different lamas and different people to court, and they gave them this official title. And so this official title is something that continued all the way up until the communists came in, until the fall of the last Chinese empire. You could go forward. But the real sort of start, where I think a lot of later Chinese found inspiration and found sort of a real historical precedent for how emperors would relate to Tibetan Buddhists, came during the Mongol dynasty. And so this was the Mongol Empire, and in China it was known as the Yuan dynasty. And this is where Mongols established relations with Sakya lamas. And so here we have an image of Sakya Pandita, who was a premier Sakya scholar at the time. And Kublai Khan, the leader of the Mongols at the time, invited him, but he sort of didn't want the job. So he ended up sending his nephew, who's here on his right, known as Pakpa, or here Chogyal Pakpa, in the 13th century. And Pakpa became the sort of first very important imperial preceptor here. So somebody who taught the emperor himself, but also at this stage, they gained a sort of political role as well. And so this became the basis of the rule of the Sakyas, the rule by the Sakyas of the Tibetan, of central Tibet also. So the Sakyas became very powerful in part because of this. So you have this role of a Tibetan Lama giving spiritual advice, giving religious instruction to emperors, and also with that, getting support to have a certain political power themselves. And this is a relationship, and not only political power, but a lot of patronage, a lot of support from the emperor for their own projects in Tibet. And so this was a sort of a relationship, this patron and priest, where it sort of worked together. You have these two realms that have very different views, but they come together and sort of each help each other with their purposes. So this period.
Tracy,
Yeah.
what brought about that sense of mutual benefit from the Chinese perspective?
Yeah.
I mean, it
Right.
might be hard to have that insight, but I'm curious.
No, it's a really good question. And I think that it's hard to say. And so one thing is that this wasn't actually a Chinese people, right? They were ruling over China. They were the emperor of China, but they were Mongols. And they were, the question of why the Mongols became Buddhist is an interesting one. And I don't have a great answer for you. Megan, maybe you have some insights. But they did, and I think that some of it had to do with their interest in Tantra, and they would see that some of these rituals might have a lot of just sort of practical benefit for them, things like protecting the emperor and doing rituals to, bring about prosperity and things like that. So I think there was a certain attraction to that side of Tantric Buddhism and a view of the Tibetans as having this sort of spiritual power that could actually help them accomplish what they wanted to in life. But other than that, I don't know particularly why. But that's actually a very central question, because we'll see going forward, like different emperors also had different takes on that, right? Some were more interested, some were less, some were actually very anti-Tibetan Buddhism. So, but yeah, so that's a good place to start. Okay, we can go forward.
If you have questions, wait for the microphone, so Zoomers and
Oh,
it's
okay.
being recorded to YouTube.
Or you can repeat it in the microphone.
Okay. Okay, so this is another image of Pakpa, and I like this image because it shows a little bit more of this story and this history. So I don't know if people see what's going on here, but there is a little image that's much smaller on to the left of Pakpa. Does anyone see what that is or have a guess who that is?
To the right or to the left?
Right.
So to the right, Tibetan style, to my side, wearing blue, to the left if you're facing. That is the Mongol emperor, right? That's Kublai Khan.
Wow.
Yeah. So here, and this image is actually Kublai Khan appointing Pakpa as the imperial preceptor, right? So giving him this role. And the Tibetans who had this got really special treatment, right? They got almost royal treatment at the courts in China. But I think, this also gives a Tibetan perspective, because I don't think that the Mongol emperor would appreciate being small and lower, and right? I mean, this clearly is about Pakpa, right? So it's an interesting dynamic that you see throughout the nations is who's talking about it, who's representing this relationship, and you get some different views. But we
Also,
can,
Tracy,
yeah.
the Kublai Khan, he's what, the grandson of Genghis Khan?
Possibly. He's definitely a direct descendant. It might be grandson. I don't remember how many generations.
But just to
yeah.
place it, because everyone's heard of Genghis Khan, but
yeah,
nobody's heard
yeah.
of Kublai Khan.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I forget which names are.
Tracy has heard.
That's right, Kim. I have. So also though, if you look at Kublai Khan in the blue, you see in between him and Pakpa here, there's another figure, right, with a little peacock feather coming out of her cap. And that's Kublai Khan's wife. And she was particularly devoted to Tibetan Buddhism as well. So you have this part of the story, right, too. And she's kind of an interesting figure in that regard, right? And then down below you have an attendant, a sort of assistant to Pakpa. I think his name was Dampa. I don't remember particularly much about him, but and then there's also, I can't see from here. I think there's a Chinese person in this too, but now I'm not seeing him.
Peeking out of a door back there.
Oh yeah.
It's like a mess.
Yeah.
No microphone, Dave.
Oh,
Or do you have
No.
that? Does that work, Steph? Yeah, I'll take it.
a question. Yes.
Yeah, actually, this is on Charlie's behalf, if you don't mind me So Charlie just mentioned, and I'm curious about this, how much retrospect plays a role with this, as this looks
50
like there's
noted.
200-year difference there.
Yeah.
That's all. Thanks.
No, and that's a really great question. And we're going to come to actually why it's an even greater question. But part of it is because this meeting between Kublai Khan and Pakpa became this extremely important moment in sort of historical memory and cultural memory, that was important for future relationships, but also was just this kind of moment where the Mongol was at its height, their empire was at its height, and Pakpa was gaining this power and this position that the Tibetans hadn't had for a long time. And it became this sort of part of the Tibetan imagination also, that they had this support from the mighty Mongol Empire, right? And we're going to see it kind of replayed as we come through some of these other historical moments. And so that's exactly true, that a couple hundred years after it happened, it was still really important. And this is how they were presenting it, right? Pakpa is this glorious figure, and the Mongol emperor is also important, but not nearly so, right? I'm not sure myself. I believe it's from central Tibet, but I don't remember. Yeah, I guess I didn't put it there. Khyentse Chenmo, I think, is from central Tibet. Do we know? Do you know? Okay. Yeah, but anyway, we better move forward too. Yeah, no, I like the questions. Please keep them coming. Okay, so apart from the human relationships, right, that this established in this sort of historical tradition of Tibetan Buddhist lamas interacting with rulers of China, it also left marks on the landscape, right, in this very interesting way. And so this is a stupa that is still standing today in Beijing, which was the capital of the Mongols' rule over China. And it's just known as the White Stupa in Beijing. But it was built actually when Kublai Khan invited a Nepalese artisan to come to his capital and create Buddhist art. And so this figure made all sorts of pieces of art, of Buddhist art for the emperor. And this is the one that is sort of the most prominent, right? This giant piece of architecture. And so this is on the left is an image of it from the 19th century, and on the right is the present day. So not much has changed, just photography. But I think it's important to understand that these relationships had sort of real effects on the ground as well. They affect the actual capital, the actual place of China, right? You have marks left. Yeah.
So I notice, we were talking a lot about, Tibetan, lamas and, Mongolian emperors, and and here we just have this first sort of indication of this real impact on the actual land of central China.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if there was any, because in the history of more Western, these patron and priest relationships, often the patron is getting a sort of perceived spiritual power from the people of their kingdom or something, and that's often the reason why. I was wondering if there's any recorded, or if you happen to know anything about how the people of China, in central China, were feeling about Tibetan Buddhism at this time, or if there's much recorded history. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great question. And there are bits and pieces that you can find about their reactions, and a lot of it comes through the sort of Confucian history that is dominant in Chinese historical records. And so in that you see a lot of sort of negative talk about Tibetan Buddhists, right? They see them as these sort of barbarians from the outside. My guess is also, there's a little bit of competition feeling about the treatment that these Tibetan Buddhists were receiving, because it was much higher than even the Confucians at many points. And so yes, you get a lot of that. And what we're talking about today mostly is at this very sort of elite level of the courts. And so that's a really important point. There are also periods where there are many Chinese devotees who take more of an interest in Buddhism, especially later in the Qing period that we're going to get to with that first image I showed. But it's a great question, and it brings up an important point that most of what we're talking about today is at the courts, right? So this isn't a discussion really of what was happening in most of like common people's lives in China. But yeah, thank you. Okay, we can go forward, Dave. Okay, so after the Mongol Empire collapses, the Ming Dynasty comes to power in China. And this is a period where China is being ruled by the Han ethnicity again, after being ruled by ethnically Mongol people for quite a while. And there is a return to Confucianism, and in general in this period there is a sort of anti-Buddhist sentiment. And so a lot of people talk about this period as where the Chinese are no longer interested in Tibetan Buddhism, and there is just much less support. But at the same time, I think these historical precedents that we were just talking about are not gone, right? And so you do see certain instances where this tradition is continuing, and emperors do use Tibetan Buddhism for their purposes in specific ways. And so here we have a picture, an image of the fifth Karmapa meeting the Yongle Emperor, who reigned in the 15th century, and he was an important Ming emperor. When he first took power, there was some question as to his ancestry and if he was a legitimate heir for the throne. And so early in his reign, he had to sort of establish his authority to rule over China. And one of the things he did was invite the fifth Karmapa to his capital in Nanjing, and have him perform all sorts of rituals. So for the prosperity of his kingdom. And there are, I'm sorry I couldn't get a good image of this, but there are these beautiful recorded paintings and imperial records of this visit that record everybody seeing miracles happening in the sky at this time, right? Which on the one hand, sort of brought the fifth Karmapa into this place of prestige and gave him a certain status for being able to conduct effective miracles. But also it gave the emperor a sort of authority that he had been looking for, right? If he was able to bring this teacher and have these religious ceremonies be effective. And bring about, they gave him a certain authority in the eyes of his people. And so again, we have, I don't know if this image brings up the last one for you, but I see certain similarities, right? So maybe we can look a little bit at what's going on in it. But the big figure here on the left in the center is the fifth Karmapa. He's wearing this black hat, right? And there's some discussion of whether the Yongle Emperor actually gifted hats, but I don't know much about this tradition. But then you can see a figure on the right in yellow robes. Does anyone have a guess who that is? That's the emperor, right? And I don't know, Dave, can you zoom in at all on this? I don't know in PowerPoint if you can do that. I don't think I did a close-up view. But on the lower left, you have a figure standing who's an attendant, right? And I don't know how well you can see it, but there are implements for the giving of an empowerment on the table in front, right? So not only do we have just the image of a large Karmapa and a smaller emperor, right? But we see that there's actually a tantric ritual being conducted here, right? So this not only is, the Karmapa giving spiritual advice, but there is actually a tantric relationship being developed between that of a teacher-student relationship, right? Yeah.
Are those the miracles in the?
Oh, yes, thank you. Thank you. Yes, they are. I forgot that. Yeah, so you can see those like, they look like little strings sort of coming up in the background under from these buildings. And those are sort of one of the miracles that showed were these rainbow lights in the sky and different birds coming. And I don't know. Oh yeah, they have the birds even, the cranes there flying, right? So these sorts of things. Yeah.
Can I also ask? Okay, sure.
So I'm just wondering, did the Yongle Emperor have any kind of political sovereignty over Tibet? I mean, or was he inviting the Karmapa from outside his territory?
My understanding is that it's outside the territory. They didn't have, I think they were interested in maintaining a certain influence so that the Tibetans didn't cause any problems for their empire, but they weren't trying to establish their own government there at the time. Yeah,
That just seems kind of different from
that's true.
the other examples where, anyway, yeah,
Yeah, right.
you're appealing to something that's like so charismatic that it goes across your boundary, your border. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it also just shows how established they saw this kind of relationship, right? It was just something within the culture, within Asia at this time, that of course the emperors would rely on the spiritual prowess of the Tibetan Buddhists, especially in times of need. Yes, Keen.
Were the tankas used as kind of like a news report, to tell people what's going on? Because like here it's kind of like a religious display, but this looks more, a little bit kind of like, can that be true?
It can, and especially the image that we looked at of Qianlong that we're going to come back to. I think that is in some ways a news report. Qianlong likes to put a lot of stuff out there. But this one, in this case, right, the actual image is from the 18th century. So in some ways, it's the retelling of history. Okay. And in this case, I think it comes from the Karma Kagyu lineage, right? And they're trying to tell a certain story about the Karmapa, right? So it's a little bit like the question we had earlier, where, yes, there are certain reasons that this is being produced when it was being produced, and that has to do with 18th century politics and interests, right? Yeah, definitely. And also many times images accompanied text, right? So not everybody could necessarily read, but it was easier to tell the stories that were being written in the texts and in the histories and biographies through an image to a wider audience, right? So absolutely. Yeah, okay, we can go to the next.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Is the temple that's in the background of the previous slide, is that the Jianning or something? It still stands today in Nanjing.
It probably, yeah, I forget the actual, the name of the temple that they did, but yeah, that they did these rituals at. But yes, the question was, is the temple still standing today? Is it an actual place? And yes, I don't remember the name, but yeah.
I think it's Jianning.
The Jianning temple, could be, yeah. Okay, so I also want to mention another relationship happening at this time, which is going to be very foundational. So the Mongol Empire collapses, right? But the Mongols themselves don't disappear, right? They sort of retreat back to the heart of Mongolia and just aren't ruling China anymore. And but there are still important and powerful Mongol leaders at the time. And one of the most important here for our purposes is this figure on the right, who is Altan Khan. He ruled over one particular group of Mongols, the Tume Mongols. The Mongols were still interested in Tibetan Buddhism, right? So you still have this relationship between Mongols and Tibetan Buddhists going. And he invites the figure on the left, who at the time was not known as the third Dalai Lama, but was just an important Gelugpa Lama. And he invites him to come see him. And it's at this time that he gives him the title of Dale, right? Which means ocean in Mongolian. And so they meet, and he then becomes the third Dalai Lama because there were two incarnations before him, right? So the first and second were never known as Dalai Lamas during their lifetime. So we have the third Dalai Lama meeting this Mongol leader, this powerful Mongol Khan, at the same time, relatively speaking, as this Ming Empire happening in China. And what's very significant about this is they were very consciously reenacting this relationship between Pakpa and Kublai Khan, because Altan Khan was a descendant of Kublai Khan, who was a descendant of Genghis Khan, right? So there's this importance of family lineage. And the Dalai Lama was then being discussed as an incarnation of Pakpa. And so they were very consciously saying, we are redoing this meeting, this historic meeting, and we have this image about this time, right? So that we looked at before of Pakpa and Kublai Khan. So it's in the air at this time, right? These relations are still continuing, both within China in some ways, although less than previous times, but also in other parts of Asia. The Tibetan Buddhists are still seen as something that secular rulers will call upon and patronize and benefit from. Yeah, so I wanted to draw attention to that as well, and then we can go forward. I'll try and wrap up soon. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Boring, when can we go home?
You out.
All we're doing is sitting here.
Only in your hometown would they treat you like this.
Right, yeah.
I've never had such heckling.
Right.
Okay. Okay, so then we're gonna get now back to this image, and this is where we'll end, but I want to spend some time because this is such a rich and interesting image, as I hope you will come to see with me, that I have loved for a long time. But the Ming dynasty then collapses in the 17th century, right? 1644, the Qing dynasty comes to power. And so once again, the Qing is this dynasty, this empire ruled by the Manchurians, right? So again, you have a non-Han people. And in China, this as well as the Mongol Empire are known as conquest dynasties. And they are seen as foreigners ruling over China. And so the Manchurians also looked to and respected the Mongols. And so they were really looking back more than to the Ming dynasty that we were just looking at, to the Mongol Empire before them, because they are this Central Asian people and they have, in some ways, more in common with the Mongols. And so they also are trying to expand their dynasty and control their people. And so one theory as to why some of these Qing emperors were so interested in Tibetan Buddhism is because the Mongols were interested in Tibetan Buddhism, and they wanted to use Tibetan Buddhism and their support to sort of have their own authority and control the Mongol people. Say, hey, look, we like Tibetan Buddhism too. See, we're the same. We're, you can trust us. We're gonna rule well. And this has been a dominant theory in Chinese history for a long time. But I would like to draw attention to other aspects too of a sort of more personal interest by these leaders in Tibetan Buddhism, that maybe it wasn't all sort of a political tool, right, to do this. So we'll look at both. I don't think we should discard it. I think, rulers do use things for political reasons. But I think that it is a little bit more nuanced than that, as this image is going to show us a little bit. So this figure, Qianlong, was raised right alongside his imperial preceptor, who was a Tibetan Gelugpa monk by the name of Chankya Ronpa Dorje. And Chankya Ronpa Dorje was brought to Beijing when he was a child. And so he and Qianlong sort of grew up together, but then Chankya became the emperor's imperial preceptor and spiritual guide, and they had a very close relationship. He also was given political responsibilities. So for example, when the 6th Dalai Lama died, Chankya Ronpa Dorje went to Tibet and helped oversee the finding of the 7th Dalai Lama and represented the Qing Empire and their interests in that as well. But they also had a very close personal spiritual relationship. So Dave, if you can go one forward. Okay. Oh, okay. So when I was talking about the sort of personal belief and interest of the emperors, this is the tomb of Qianlong Emperor. And you can see that on the walls of the tomb and all around where he was buried, you have Tibetan Buddhist images and you have Tibetan Dharani and different prayers that are there. And so I think that for me, when I look at this, I think, I don't think he's speaking to his Mongol constituents anymore through this, right? But I think it shows that he had a certain interest and he had a certain belief in the efficacy and in the power of the Tibetan Buddhist teachings. So much so that he wanted to be buried, and they actually made his tomb effectively like a Tibetan Buddhist stupa. And it's a very different arrangement than a Chinese traditional pagoda or a Chinese tomb. The outside looks very Chinese, but inside in this personal space, like we get some insight into the emperor's feelings, and he chose to be buried around mantras, basically. Okay, so we can go forward. One more, maybe. There, okay. Well, okay, so it's one back, maybe. It's a little cut off. Okay. Well, maybe we can just talk and you guys can look at this image a little, and we're going to look at some of the details of it because it's very rich. But we have this central image, right, who is Qianlong. Actually, maybe Dave, yeah, if you could go up 2 just for a moment. Yeah, forward 2 more. Yeah, there. Let's stay here for a moment. So does anyone notice anything about this image that is...
He's holding a Dharma wheel in
Yeah.
his hand.
Yes. Okay, so what does that indicate? Do we know? It's like teaching, right? He's turning the wheel of Dharma. And so Qianlong was very consciously kind of putting himself up, and also understood by the Tibetans at many points as this Chakravartin figure, right? So this is like a wheel-turning king who rules over the world and is this Buddhist ideal of a ruler, right? And so here, this wheel is representing that, right? He's not just any emperor. He's not just any lama. He's a Chakravartin, right? Other things you notice about this image, yeah?
Maybe this is more just a couple questions about
Sure.
some of the people surrounding, so
Yeah.
within that. Sorry. So for the people immediately surrounding, I have a couple questions about them and the people kind of within the circles on the top and the bottom.
Yes.
Are those, I'm wondering if they're maybe people that were, if any of them were like actually like living people, a part of his political system at the time? Is he imagining them as reincarnations of himself or Dalai Lamas, or is it a mix between religious leaders and political leaders, or is it none of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there is one figure in this image that is his contemporary, and that is the one right above him in the blue circle. which is a little bit hidden here by the notification there. But that figure is Chankya Ronpa Dorje, who is his preceptor and also is his lama, right? So he's placing him in the image right above his head in the root, in the location that Tankas will put a root guru, right? So I think it even says under there, like Zawe Lama, right? The root guru, and that's an image of Chankya Ronpa Dorje. So he's the only one. The figures directly around him, I believe, are lineage lamas of the Gelugpa, which is also very interesting, right? He's placing himself within a teaching lineage, you know, and we have this patron-priest relationship, but Qianlong takes this a little bit farther, right? He's not just an emperor, he's also a spiritual teacher in his own right, right? Does that answer? Yeah. Yeah.
It looks like Milarepa, it's wearing white.
It could be. I don't remember all of them, but yeah, but I think, yeah, it does.
He's so encyclopedic and everything, is that I just
Yeah.
wonder if he's including all the lineage lamas of all the lineages.
It could be because Qianlong was this type.
Yeah, that's definitely Milarepa, but, oh, in fact, it says Mila, they all have names under them, I guess.
Okay,
so-
okay. Right, I sort of remember that now, that like he traces his lineage back to India through this lineage. So I don't know each of them, but right, like the point that I think your question brings up is that he's really trying to place himself in history and in a Tibetan Buddhist context as part of that, and as belonging and upholding this lineage, right? And being central to it. And so this is why Qianlong is very interesting, because I think that takes a lot of guts to kind of make yourself into this tanka, right?
But also, Trace,
Yeah.
I mean, above it all, the Manchus, it's short for Manjushri.
Thank you. So this is where we're going next.
Yeah.
And I wish I could zoom in even farther.
I think if he goes forward one.
Do I go farther? Okay.
I think you have.
Dave, can you go forward one? Oh, thank you. I did do that. Good job. Okay. So in his left hand, he's holding this Dharma wheel, right? He's the Chakravartin. But what kind of Chakravartin? In his right hand, you can see he's making this gesture, right? And what is hard to see here, even at this level of zooming, is that there's a string. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay, so there's this string. Yeah.
This is the image that you put on the website.
Oh, good. Is it detailed? Yeah, good. So there is a string, and can you tell us, can you see what it is connected to by chance? No?
It gets lost around his elbow, so I can't.
Okay,
see.
okay.
But it seems to be maybe continuing from around the top of his head and down his arm and probably to everything around him.
Okay, and what? Yes, so one is the lotus. You can see on his right and left shoulders, there are two lotuses, right? On the right, this is a lotus flower, and one of the strings connects to. And on the left, on top of that lotus, can you tell what that is on his left shoulder?
The text.
Oh, there's a text and, oh wait, oh, sorry, on the right hand load, on his right shoulder, on top of the lotus, can you tell what that is?
It looks like a torma.
Looks like a torma
Oh,
or a
perhaps
sword.
it's a sword.
Could it be a sword?
So you have a sword
There we go.
and a text. Now does this, right? Okay, yes. So we have this reference here to Manjushri, which is why he was known as, or this representation is because, rather, that he was known as the Manjushri emperor, right? So for Tibetans, this gave him this very important status, right? And, you know, he ran with it. I believe he presented this image to the 7th Dalai Lama, which I think is he was a character, we can say, in the least. right? But the Tibetans also did see him. They refer to him as the Manjushri emperor, as a term of respect. Also, I wonder if we have, if we can look at his face for a moment. Does it, it's very realistic, right?
Yeah.
So he actually had an Italian Jesuit painter at his court.
Wow.
And he had, yeah, and so he had this Italian Jesuit paint this face before
Wow.
he sent it to the Tibetan painters in his workshops to complete. And so you get this very realistic face, right? I believe the face of Chankyarope Dorje might be done by Castiglione was his name, as well. But right, so you have this mix, and he wanted to make sure you knew it was Qianlong, and indeed it does look like him. Yeah, but so already we see, he's presenting himself in this new way, but he has his Tibetan guru at the top of his head. And now, if you know what, Dave, if you can go back again to zoom out, I want to look at other parts of this image for a moment. Maybe one more, or to the full image. I can't see it now myself from here, but is it? Maybe I was thinking of a different image, but anyway, what I want to sort of end with then, I'll wrap up in shortly, is this connection to Manjushri, right? So again, just like in the Mongol period, you have these real marks left on the landscape. I think the idea of Qianlong as a Manjushri emperor also has something to do with the landscape of China, right? So China is the home to this mountain sort of retreat, Buddhist mountain retreat of Wu Taishan, or the 5 terraced mountains, which is known and had been known in China since the 7th century, earlier, at least, as the abode on the earth of Manjushri, right? So in the Tibetan mind, China had always been associated with Manjushri in some way, right? And so that's where this association of the emperor with Manjushri came from. So Dave, if you can go forward to, there's a map. I think I wrote down as early as the 5th century, so that must be. This is now a 19th century depiction by a Mongol Buddhist of Wu Taishan, right? And so you can see a white stupa here. The one in Beijing was not the only one, but I think this one was a little bit later, possibly. And this is a very cool image. If anyone wants to explore it more, the painting now belongs to the Rubin Museum of Art, and on their website they have a feature where you can zoom in and they'll tell you about every little part of this. So that's kind of fun to look at. I can't do it here, but during this period of Qianlong especially, he took great interest in this, and it became sort of a summer retreat from the heat of Beijing. They would go there, but it also became very important for the Tibetan Buddhist lamas who were given positions at court. So one of the biggest temples at Wu Taishan in this period, and maybe still today, is the Pusading Temple, which is actually a Tibetan Buddhist temple. And so especially for the Tibetans who were coming from the mountains down to the hot weather in Beijing, they would just run here in the summer because it was much more hospitable to them. But this became a very important sort of imperial place, and the marks from the Qianlong period are still visible in the landscape here today.
We'll have to dig it out, Tracy, too. There's a wonderful account by John Blofeld of experience he had at Wu Taishan in the 1920s or 30s. I can't remember. Some high Mongolian Lama coming and the reactions in the crowd and that, to find that. So John Blofeld was a British diplomat who was assigned to then Siam and took a trip to Hong Kong and ended up again bumping unexpectedly into a Mongolian Lama and took an empowerment and took refuge. And from that time on, he spent many, many years in China, and it wrote some of the first kind of books introducing Tibetan Buddhism and Buddhism as a whole to the West. And Gretchen and I had the good fortune of welcoming him as a guest, a visitor to the Rochester Zen Center, and we were shuffling him around town. Just truly beautiful man, but his books are very wonderful too. It was an introduction to Buddhism, Wu Tai Shan.
Yeah, so in this image, you can see it's hard because it's not zoomed in, but the little sort of black dots under the stupa that kind of create this diagonal line going up are actually sort of processions and pilgrims and rituals happening. I think in here somewhere there's like a cham dance going on, and it's really a very rich image of the sort of Buddhist culture at Wu Tai Shan, which is just a little ways out of Beijing, outside Beijing. So it's very accessible in some ways, but still separated. Okay, and then to sort of end on back with the Qianlong Emperor and his peculiarities and interesting persona, Dave, if you can go one final. The Manchurians had their own summer retreat that was to the north of Beijing, and so this is their summer retreat called Chengde. And at Chengde, it was Qianlong created a sort of, and his grandfather and father as well worked on, but this part is Qianlong's vision. He worked on sort of representing his whole empire to his different peoples. So he would host audiences, or when he called people to come and pay tribute to him from different parts of his empire, he would bring them here. And he had sort of his whole empire in not actually miniature, actually almost life-size, sort of recreated there for his constituents to see. So I wonder if anyone knows what this building might be.
Right.
Yeah, right. So he built, I don't know if it's full scale actually, but it's close if it's not. And this is, oh, I don't know if it's full scale, but this is the Potala Palace, a copy of it that Qianlong had built at his summer retreat, where he would bring Tibetans. He also built a replica of Tashi Lumbo Monastery, which is the Panchen Lama's monastery in central Tibet. So he had that built as well. So when the Tibetan Lamas would come, he would show them their own homeland, I guess, which is why I think he's an incredibly funny kind of emperor character, but also someone with a lot of creative vision and cosmopolitan ideas.
Can I ask about his relationship with the Dalai Lamas?
Yeah.
And also, like, if the Dalai Lama is the embodiment of Avalokiteshvara, and he rules from the palace of Potala, which is Avalokiteshvara's holy mountain, and then you have the Manjushri ruler ruling from Wu Tai Shan in China. I just wonder about that symbolism.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the symbolism was clear to everyone involved. And I think that he had a little bit less personal relations with the Dalai Lamas, but mostly because they were more young during his reign. So he came to power, I believe, during the life of the sixth Dalai Lama. I don't think he overlapped his reign with the fifth Dalai Lama. I'm getting dates confused in my head, but anyway, he was sort of very interested from a political point of view, for sure, and probably, from a spiritual point of view, but I think he also very much recognized the political power of the Dalai Lamas, and so he was certainly very involved in keeping control politically of Tibet in a way that we hadn't seen in previous dynasties. So I think the politics of it was made that relationship a little tenuous. But and so like I said, he sent Chankya to Lhasa to help recognize the seventh Dalai Lama and to make sure that the recognition of this boy was not somebody who was going to challenge the Qing dynasty and so forth, right? But I think it was probably in large part because of that political role, and also because of the age of the Dalai Lamas, that he was had a stronger relationship with the Panchen Lamas and Chankya. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm wondering why I've never seen this photo before. Truly, I
Yeah.
had no knowledge of it.
Yeah.
I guess your presentation also makes me think about like our perspectives, and that we're so focused on like India and China, but there's this whole like Central Asian perspective where like Tibet is an international culture. Tibet is like the charismatic cosmopolitan culture that everyone's trying to connect to, but because we never pay attention to Central Asia, like that's lost on us.
Yeah, for sure.
So I don't know what you.
Yeah, and I think in some ways you can see during the Qing period, Tibetan Buddhism was almost, and Tibetan language was almost like the Latin of Asia at the time, right? It really traveled from northeast Asia all the way down to the Himalayas. So yeah, and right, farther north. And
How far away is this from Lhasa?
so this is northeast of Beijing. And it's so it's very far from Lhasa. It's not even, I mean, it's the Manchurian lands, their ancestral lands. So traditionally it wasn't even Chinese, although today it's part of China.
Amazing that the Chinese have not destroyed it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I think that there were periods where it may have been destroyed by the British actually during their invasion of Beijing, but it's been rebuilt and but yeah, I don't know the history of why it wasn't destroyed like during the Cultural Revolution, for example.
Similarly with that pillar at the Jokang in Lhasa.
Yeah, there are
talks
certain
about
things that
Tibet
survive.
conquering the capital of China. I always wondered why the Chinese, maybe they
Would
just
leave
didn't
that.
read it, they didn't care,
Well,
Yeah.
it also sets up the relationship, so.
Gotcha. Sets up the, also, because of the conquest of the Mongol Empire, I mean, you talk about them being cosmopolitan, it went all the way out to the Caspian Sea.
Right.
I mean, the Mongols almost conquered Vienna, I think, right? They were right on the
They were-
edge of
yeah, they were
Eastern
on the
Europe,
edge of
and
Europe.
the Mongols conquered Russia for 400 years. So, they had this perspective that was really Asia-wide. It's
Right.
really rather remarkable.
Yeah.
We don't think of it that way. We think of Tibet as like being lost horizons and Shangri-La,
Yeah.
this apart from the rest of the world, but it was actually influencing people all over the place.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of looking at maps of Asia when thinking about this, where you just take away the borders and you just look at sort of a topographical vision. Because when you see it that way without, like, it's very hard for us, I think, to get out of our modern view of nation states and these borders, right? And like, oh, is this Tibet or China? Well, it was always more fluid than that. And before we had countries as we know them now, there was a very different concept of power and territory and things like this going on, and sort of where influence and things came from, right? So if you can have that perspective of just looking at this giant landmass that is populated by different peoples with different cultures, you get a sort of different perspective of what was happening at the time. Dave?
Compare what the image you've just shown us, how Tibet was kind of central to the entire Central Asia. And yet, by the time young husband came to Tibet, it was a closed society. How did that happen, or is that just a misperception on our part?
I mean, I think in some ways it's a misperception that has to do with this Western idea of presenting Tibet as this Shangri-La, like pure land away from the rest of the world, right? That was never really the case. But it also happened because in the 19th century, you have so many more actors coming on the stage of power. You have the Europeans coming into Europe, and this is something scary. It's messing with this sort of status quo of how Asia had related to itself for so long. And you have these Europeans coming who are clearly have the sort of military prowess, right? And so I think that led both China and Tibet to say like, okay, wait, hold on here.
Japan too.
Yeah, this is scary. What?
Japan too.
And Japan too, yes. So all of a sudden the world was changing, right? You were getting a more globalized world, and that really changed. But it didn't cut things off altogether. There were still relations happening between Tibet and China. And so I taught a semester class on this topic where we looked in more detail at all of these relations happening. And where we ended was looking at a picture of the 14th Dalai Lama meeting Mao, right? And like, how is this compared to the relationships we're looking at here? You know, obviously very different, but also that meeting happening belongs to the same tradition that was 800 years in the making. And, you know, so it wasn't, I think when I first encountered those relations and the politics of the 20th century in Tibet, I saw it very differently. And, you know, the more I have looked, the more you see that it's part of a historical tradition, right? And there's also a big rupture, and it's very different because the emperors, even if they weren't the strongest believers like Qianlong in Tibetan Buddhism, they were amenable to it, whereas Mao was talking about religion as poison. But so what does that rupture do to these kinds of relationships in this history, right?
And, you know, every Tibetan that we meet, they know all this, or at least it's in their, you know, their cultural understanding, just like, you know, we've got the Liberty Bell and stuff, and going back even farther. And so it's so interesting to me because we don't have any of that. You know, we don't have that perspective when we talk to them in even a worldly way. At one point, I remember, I can't remember what the question was, but Garon Pache just referred to, oh yeah, that was when the Gelugpas took over our monasteries. Because at one point, the Gelugpas took over a bunch of monasteries in eastern Tibet.
Well, and they did that because Qianlong was patronizing
Thank
and
you.
they had the support of these emperors.
Thank you.
And so they were able to rebuild their monasteries and to expand because they had the powerful empire at their east behind them,
Yeah,
right?
thank you. I did not know that, but
Yeah.
what tickled my fancy was that Garon Pache was referring to this as if it happened yesterday. It was centuries ago, and we don't know. And I think it's so wonderful for us because it builds faith too, knowing this is not just some sort of, you know, like the job interview I had where I was trying to explain 10-year gap in my resume before the Dalai Lama won the Nobel Peace Prize, you know, and it was just like, what were you doing for 10 years? And I said, well, I was at a Buddhist center. And he said, oh, Buddhism, yeah. My wife was into witchcraft. So instead of these kinds of ideas, you see there's something greater you're talking about. Millions of peoples and cultures and civilizations. And it's a much deeper and wider perspective. Thank you.
Can I just share one fun fact?
Yeah.
This is because I am kind of work on like the period before
Yeah,
where Tracy's picked up. I always draw my line in the sand at the Mongols. But so when the Tonga, which Tracy pointed to the Tonga as like one of the earliest moments for these relationships. So the Tonga, one of the lamas they were courting, I don't know that he ever got this title of imperial preceptor, but was Lord Jigten Sumgun,
Well,
who,
Oh, right.
you know, so the
Thank you.
Drikung,
I should-
our lineage here had a brush with imperial greatness.
Well, I think wasn't it actually that Jigdun Sumgun declined,
Yeah.
and then they invited the Sakyas too?
Yes,
So,
there's-
who then
So tell
became-
that to the Sakyas.
Yes. Yeah, the Sakyas and the Jiguns were not always good friends as they are now.
Yeah, thank you.
But yeah, and I think, just the final, well, okay, do you want to ask a question? Yeah, please.
Hi. So I think I'm walking away from this presentation oddly more optimistic than I thought I would about the future of Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, the intricate relationship with Chinese history, etc. Is that the right feeling? And thank you.
I mean, I think it's a perfectly fine reaction, and I think that the more you learn about history and these complex relationships, the more you understand that it's not as black and white as we often see, right? And so, even in the 21st century, you have many Chinese Han devotees to Tibetan Buddhism within Tibet, right? And you have businessmen who go to Tibetan lamas for rituals to help them, make more money.
Right.
And I think in some ways, all of those phenomena can be traced back to these relationships, right? The place of Tibetan Buddhists in the cultural imagination of the Chinese and vice versa, right? And each benefited in some way. And I think it's a very interesting dynamic, because you have each one in some ways thinking that they're the superior, but they found a sort of balance where they didn't have to force the other one to see it that way, right? You have the spiritual guide who the lamas obviously, if you're looking from a Tibetan Buddhist perspective, there's nothing higher than the lama, right? They're the ones that are going to get you out of samsara. An emperor is nothing compared to that, right? But for an emperor, they can be sort of tools in there, or help them after they die and what comes after. But for the worldly, there's nothing mightier than them as an emperor. But they found a balance, and I think that still exists in a certain way. There's certain strains of it, and I'm not saying everything's like complete optimism from my perspective, but I think that, the more you learn about history, the more you see that it is complicated, and it's that a lot of the sort of picture that has been painted for us has to do, just like these images, with present concerns, right? More than what actually was or even is going on necessarily on the ground. So I think that's fine.
Just as a modern example of that relationship, when Jerry and Joellen and Frank and I went to Tibet 3-4 years ago now, wow. We flew to Jining first, which is a city it's in China, right? It's China, but right near the border of Tibet, of the actual Tibet, and stayed with Khenpo Sherab Ozer, who is a Tibetan Lama that Garchen Rinpoche had sent here in the early 200s, and taught to us. He traveled around, but he taught to us here at White Lotus for several years. We did he's just amazing. He's wonderful. And we stayed with him in his apartment, which was, I think it was bought. He's totally supported by a Chinese businessman, like Tracy said. And he has a sangha of Chinese. He went back he went back in 2007 to Tibet to teach to nuns in, in Kham, thank you. And, but in certain periods of the year, he goes to this apartment that he owns now, and I'm sure it's thanks to this Chinese businessman and the sangha there in Xining. and brings some of his nuns there to really train on computer, and they're doing a lot of things with texts and stuff like that. But and then he had a dinner. The Chinese businessman threw a big dinner for us at his
building.
His building. It was like, I guess, where he lived, but where he worked, and it was
Yeah, he had a whole kitchen in there. I mean,
this huge building.
you know, it was like a 5-story building, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah, and we were in like a banquet
Yeah.
hall or something, and
Yeah.
Jerry was toasting with the businessman until, and Kempo was laughing away, and until finally Kempo put his arm on Jerry's arm and said, "Okay, better stop." But we had
Chinese firewater, you go around and you toast.
But it was this huge dinner with a lot of their Sangha there, and you know, when they picked us up at the airport, they even picked us up at the airport, and it was his Chinese students who were driving, carrying her, well, those were his nuns, actually, but anyway, yeah, so there's, that's just a modern day example of that, right?
Yeah.
And there's a photograph of Temple Shambles on the horse in the back for.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes.
Rachel's pointing out the photo of Kempo Sherab on a horse in the back corner of the shrine. Okay. There you go. Okay, well, thank you, Tracy.
Yeah,
I
thank
greatly
you guys
appreciate
for listening.